Hello, everyone. My name is Camila Ribeiro. I'm a doctoral student at the Tropical Forest and People Research Center. I'm back here at the Agriculture and Forest Ecology unit as a guest lecturer once more to talk about agroforestry systems today. I've been working with agroforestry systems for 10 years with agroforestry experiences in Peru, Bolivia, Brazil, Australia, and now currently I'm developing my thesis looking at different agroforestry experiences in the Philippines. I subtitled our lecture today as Beyond Consociations of Trees and Crops because it's quite common to see, one may think that agroforestry is just about planting trees and agricultural crops together at the same space, and this is it. But hopefully today I'll be able to demonstrate to you some of the technical aspects we should consider when developing effective and productive agroforestry systems. So a bit of an overview of today's lecture. We're going to go through the definitions of agroforestry systems. Now I'm using the acronym AFS from now on. If you see AFS, I'm referring to agroforestry systems. We're going to look a bit at the different types of AFS we have, the variables that comprise these systems, some differences of traditional and successional agroforestry systems, its principles, design, and management. So we'll start by the definition. We can identify agroforestry studies back in the early 1980s. And the first definitions you see in literature are referred in this slide, and can be understood as an approach to land use and natural resources management that integrate woody and perennial crops. Just like I said in the beginning, the integration of trees and crops. But nowadays, in the most recent works, as the one I'm bringing as an example, a study from 2017, we have sort of progressed on these definitions from a simple combination of trees and crops to a multifunctional stratified species assemblage that are designed to emphasize biodiversity, the ecological succession, but also the productivity of these systems. So agroforestry systems are now found everywhere in all the continents, and they present the potential to improve the livelihood of smallholder farmers, bringing more food security and sovereignty, bring more income diversification, and it's also a great opportunity for community development. I will bring you some experiences here today as how we can utilize these agroforestry systems not only as a land used to produce food and other important goods for us, but it can also be a very important tool for community and rural development. There are a number of studies out there looking at agroforestry systems at different aspects. I'm naming some here in this slide. So looking at the viability and the potential of agroforestry systems to mitigate climate change, provide multiple ecosystem services, utilize it as a strategy for pest management, for carbon sequestration and optimizing nutrient cycling. For water, can be there are studies that show that AFS can be a much more water efficient system compared to other agricultural models and forestry models. And also the financial viability in terms of both net returns and the returns on labor input invested have also been proven. I'm naming some of the studies in brackets. You'll be able to refer to these studies at the end of these slides with the references. Now, the types of agroforestry systems, you have the agro-silvicultural systems, some examples in the pictures here, which are basically the combination of shrubs and vegetable and root crops. There are different designs that you can apply. So here would be more of like an alley cropping system in rows, but the trees can also be mixed amongst crop lines. There are also the silvopastoral systems, so it is the combination of tree species, the cultivation of trees for timber or fruits, and livestock, and also different types of livestock. So here we see cattle, but also you can also integrate poultry, goats and sheep. The possibilities are endless. And we also have the crop forestry livestock systems, which is would be a combination of the two previous types we just seen. They can either be integrated as rotational, so different plots at a farm that rotate these land uses, but there can also be an integration depending on the livestock, depending on the ages of the trees. But regardless of what type of agroforestry we're talking about, they all comprise several variables that we have to take into consideration when designing and managing these systems. So the first variable, the first characteristic of the agroforestry systems is that they are complex. So unlike monocultures or monoplantations, they usually comprise different species that have different nutrient, water requirements, different architectural, different physiology. There's also the variable of scale, labor input, and you can also apply agroforestry for different objectives. We'll have a look at complexity. So the simplest AFS you can find around would be maybe consociation of two species. In this example, we have banana and coffee. So we see the coffee here integrated with banana trees. You can also have Towngia systems, which are a term that emerged in Asia, and it basically refers to the integration of agricultural crops with trees. And you also have the successional agroforestry systems, which would be the most complex type of AFS. So these types, the successional agroforestry, they usually comprise a lot more species, and the duration of these species in the system is very dynamic. So you have species that will be in the system, say maybe for the first 4 months, and then when they are harvested, they are already replaced by other species, and there's intense intense management in many of the cases for the successional agroforestry systems. And there's an interesting terminology on the successional agroforestry practitioners that say that agroforestry is not a picture, agroforestry is a movie. And I think this analogy illustrates very much what the successional agroforestry systems are. They are dynamic, unlike, say, maybe a system that comprises only 2 species. In this one, you will see different characters, and as the species change, you can also see sort of the scenery changing. So the other variable is the scale. So it can be agroforest home gardens, can be agroforestry farms. And in terms of scale, there's also this terminology you can also find in academia, in research and development, the terminology agroforest landscapes, which not always refer to agroforestry systems. Sometimes you find this terminology referring to large areas that comprise different land uses that host trees, maybe silvicultural plantations or agricultural crops. They're not, this term not necessarily refer to AFS as we're going to study here. Now there's also for labor input is one of the important variables for AFS. Depending on the type of, on the area, on the resources you have available, the amount of labor input that you can invest in your system is going to change, but there, you mostly gonna have to consider that usually agroforestry systems work with crop rotations, with mulching, with grass management in a way that is usually different than other approaches in other land uses. We usually try not to fight against the grasses, but rather utilize their incredible potential to enhance the productivity of our systems. AFS usually works with prunings, with a lot of prunings, and obviously with the harvest. So there will be different harvests throughout the year, and all of these will require different amounts of labor input. Still talking about labor input, this is one of the, I would say, some of the bottlenecks when we're talking about agroforestry and its adoption. Because many say that, oh, you know, AFS is a too labor intensive system. Some studies, and including my work in the Philippines, which I intend to share with you soon, we see that this labor input requirement can also be looked at not only as an obstacle, of course, in some situations it might be, but we can also utilize this labor requirement to promote community involvement, to address unemployment in urban areas, to stimulate the youth to be involved with farming, which is a problem in many countries nowadays. The age of the farming the population who are farmers are usually getting old, and the youth all want to migrate to the city. So, and also it can be utilized, this labor input can also be utilized to address education. So in this, these pictures here show real world experience in Southeast Brazil, South and Southeast, where communities of farmers, they formed farmers associations, and they were bringing school children to visit their farms. They were making working bee days. So every day, all of the farmers in this association would go to one specific farm to help the farmer with a specific job that required a lot of people. And then in the next week, all of them would go to another farm and they would help each other. And that creates, that not only optimizes the work needed to manage these systems, but they also create endless opportunities for community development, for teaching younger generations the importance of productive systems that work with the nature and not against it. And the last variable I bring here is the objective. So AFS can be utilized as a restoration tools, and there's even legislation nowadays in some countries where you can the protection area can be an agroforestry system, and can also be you can also have an AFS with the objective of like a commercial scale for production and for commercial needs specifically. This picture here is, for example, from a farm in Caribbean, a banana farm, and so you can see it has the designs like straight rows to facilitate management and harvest, and you can also see that it's quite a big scale as well. Now, some differences between traditional and successional agroforestry systems. So, as I said before, we have advanced a little bit on this concept that agroforestry is just putting trees and crops together. And so we are transitioning from sole species consociation to now looking at developing systems that have complex species succession in space and time, that are highly diverse, and that understands the nature's ecological succession, the nature's dynamic. And we apply this nature, we sort of channel these nature dynamics to make our systems more productive. And in terms of use of external inputs, we are also transitioning, expanding, evolving our concept of AFS to have systems that aim at independence from external inputs. That is, of course, a gradual transition. We have spoken about transitions in the previous lecture when we talked about agroecology and the importance of in the future, given our resource and climate situation, we aim at developing systems that are less and less dependent on external inputs, and that considers the biogeochemical processes. So the most evolved, sophisticated AFS, they are more based on ecological processes and biogeochemical processes rather than inputs application. It's a lot more about processes than about inputs. Another important characteristics of AFS is that we should look at where these systems are being implemented. So say you want to implement an agroforestry system, an important first step is to look at the area and assess whether this area is in a accumulation or abundance stage. And from the stage it is at, we aim at promoting gradual improvements with the proper management, which we will talk about later on today. So in an accumulation stage is, the accumulation stage is the most common situation we see out there. Are areas that have gone through some sort or some level of disturbance. This disturbance can be either by fire or deforestation or an intensive previous land use. Some characteristics of accumulation systems that are in accumulation stage is that there is low carbon. The soils are usually acidic. The phosphorus is immobile, so there is phosphorus in the soil, but it cannot be. It is not available for plants to make use of this phosphorus. There are also levels of iron and aluminum, so some sort of toxicity as well. These areas, they have high carbon nitrogen ratios. The plants you find in these areas, they might present coriaceous leaves, and there are no fruit trees or few fruit trees or large mammals, because these ecosystems, the ecosystems have to be in balance in order to sustain large mammals. So in situations like this, we can start an agroforestry system, but it is important to utilize species that are, we would say, that thrive in more harsh environments. So an example of these would be utilizing grasses such as Stylosanthis, or pigeon peas, which are nitrogen fixing and fast growing species that can help restore biomass. And we utilize these the residues of pigeon peas to protect the soil and improve its physical and chemical properties. Eucalyptuses are also species that can be strategically utilized in areas of accumulation stage. So these, the characteristic of these species is that they thrive in acidic soils, and they are not as demanding for nutrients as some other species from the abundance stage, which are areas with abundance. In abundance stage are usually areas that have low disturbance. You can see a structured forest or a structured vegetation, native vegetation. The ratio between carbon and nitrogen is lower. The phosphorus is more available to plants because the life in the soil is making all the biochemistry that makes the phosphorus available. There's more microbial activity. The leaves of these vegetation that are characteristic of abundance stages, that they are more tender, they evapotranspire more, so there's more evapotranspiration in these systems. They don't have to be as, their leaves don't have to be as thick as in accumulation stage, because they don't suffer as much from drought or intensive heat. And so the hydrological cycles are somewhat imbalanced, and there's the presence of large and frugivorous mammals. So these are some of the characteristics that you could look at in order to assess whether the agroforestry you want to establish, this is going to give you an idea of how your agroforestry should be started, should be composed. Now we're going to go through some of the principles after learning a bit of the general characteristics and what we should look, some of the things we should look at the areas in order to assess how we should design the systems. We're going to look at the principles that will tell us how we should manage and implement our AFS. So there are, depending on the academic or even practitioners, there are some excellent people out there that are not necessarily in academia, but have a lot of practical experience. So depending on the academic or the practitioner, they will have a different number of principles. Here I selected only some key ones, but of course there are some other details and some other aspects. But this would be, in my understanding, in my experience, the spinal cord of any AFS, any good and productive AFS out there. So high diversity, natural succession, the system has stratification, soil cover and plant density. The system concentrates energy and generates biomass efficiently. And there is selective plant removal and pruning. When we talk about high diversity in AFS, we're not only talking about the more, the better. It's a lot more technical than that. It's about choosing species that perform varied ecophysiological functions. For example, you can have one species that will mainly provide ecosystem services. For example, species that flower, that will attract pollinators. This is an example of a species in AFS that provides ecosystem services. For biomass, so pigeon peas, as I mentioned previously, or some other types of fast-growing species like Leucaena or Gliricidia, or even banana trees. Not trees, because bananas are technically grasses, but they provide this biomass. Or species that perform a function of enhancing soil fertility. So the leguminous species such as pigeon peas that will fix nitrogen in the soil. And then you can also have some other species that will perform that have economic interest, which are the species that you will effectively sell in the market or utilize to process and produce a certain sort of good. or you can have one species can be performing different functions as well. So actually, the more functions one species can bring to the system, the better. And by applying the concept of high diversity in AFS, you can make a better use of vertical and horizontal spaces. You optimize space use. You can promote beneficial interactions. Although not always the combinations provide the beneficial interactions. This is why we should know the species that we are utilizing. But you can also promote biological control of pests and diseases, examples of some studies here. You can check. This higher diversity in AFS can also promote income diversification, and that's a good thing for farmers. So they are not only dependent on one single species, and in case there is maybe a drought or typhoons or things like that, the crop fails, they have other species in which they can extract livelihoods and income from. And also financial returns. I'm also citing another study here where the author performed a literature review looking at different agroforestry systems throughout Brazil, and concluded that the more diverse the system, the more highest financial returns the system promoted. So quite interesting. Second principle is the natural succession. So AFS practitioners are always trying to learn from nature, observing the ecological processes that take place in their local vegetation, in the local ecosystems, and applying these principles and applying these successional dynamics in their AFS. An example would be, say, in a natural setting, in a rainforest, when there's an impactful climatic event. An old tree falls that opens a glade in the forest. This glade opens a space for more sunlight to reach the ground. The ground is covered because all the dead leaves that fall from the ground creates this litter layer, which is very important to protect the soil and protect all the microbial activity taking place there. All the seed bank, the seeds, the falling seeds that were there dormant now after this impactful event has now received sort of a triggering and they start to germinate. There is, of course, a high diversity of species that start emerging from this one impactful climatic event. So we try to apply these sort of dynamics in the system, and we respect the succession. We understand that there are some species that live from through a certain time span in the system, and then another species comes over and takes place, and this is an ongoing learning process. We're always observing and always keeping this attitude of being a student and learning from nature. The stratification. So as you can see here in these images, besides the natural succession and the higher diversity, we see that the species occupy different strata in the system. So you have a few, in a smaller number, the emergent species that occupy the highest strata. Then you have high species which are a little bit lower and in a slightly bigger proportion in numbers in comparison to the emergence. We have species that occupy medium, low, and herbaceous strata. So this is good for an AFS because it maximizes the photosynthesis. It allows us to plant in higher densities. And of course, we apply this stratification also understanding the natural succession, understanding the seasonality of species, and understanding that some of the species will remain for longer and some others will remain for shorter periods in the AFS. So here's an example of stratification. Another very important principle here is soil cover and plant density. So for now, as you can see in number 3, we were talking more of like when you look above ground, and in number 4 is sort of stratification, but it's below ground when we talk about plant density. So it is very important to keep the soil covered, because in AFS we intend to have different species that will perform different functions. We will always have those species that will provide biomass to us, and we utilize the biomass we have to keep the soil protected. I cannot stress enough the importance of keeping the soil protected. I'll show you this image first, depicting a soil that is protected by a layer of mulch. And so you have the impact of sunlight, of rain, of wind, and when the soil is protected with mulch, you avoid soil loss, nutrient loss, moisture loss. This is very beneficial for the plants and for the below ground microbiota. And on the right hand side, you can see here when the soil is not protected, the raindrops impact, break down the soil particles, there's more moisture, evaporation, the heat builds up, the plants, excuse me, the plants don't perform as good. So we cannot stress enough the importance of keeping the soil covered. You can utilize different materials. So here in these pictures, you see 3 different materials. Here is more of sort of a finer plant residue material. In here, they utilize pruned trees, the branches of pruned trees. Some other examples, some other ways in which you can keep the soil covered. So here, even finer material, probably from grass mowing. In this illustration, it shows like how thick of a mulch layer you can apply in your agroforestry tree rows or crop rows. But it's important to leave an area for the base of the plant to quote unquote breathe, so not to accumulate excessive heat and moisture that can bring fungal or bacterial diseases. But it is interesting in many instances to leave sort of a slope, sort of directing raindrops and water to go towards the tree roots. Some species like citruses, they don't like that. So if this was a citrus plant, would actually be the contrary. you would have a slope directing water towards away from the base of the roots. But in most cases, it is beneficial to apply a mulch layer, always leaving some space for plant aeration, but also stimulating moisture and water to concentrate and go towards the roots. Here's some other examples. In terms of plant density, we do apply this principle in AFS, but we should be aware that the plants that we place in density, they have different root structure. So you would maybe, if you have several root crops in your AFS, for example, you might want to associate, not place all the root crops in the same area. For example, cassava, sweet potato, and carrots all in one area. You would maybe place the root crops with maybe some leaf crops, which have a more superficial root system. So important to be aware of that. I think this illustration summarizes quite well what I'm referring to here. So you see an example of planting high density here. You have corn, you have bananas growing, you have some brassicas here. This illustration shows some techniques to plant in higher density. As an example here, cassava. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but it's just to illustrate that yes, planting in higher density is possible and can be productive. You have to pay attention into the different root systems that you are combining, the angle that you are planting certain species, but also trying to break away from this concept that there will always be competition. So competition is not the only dynamics that takes place in nature. And if you combine the species correctly, they can rather, instead of only competing, they can rather cooperate. An example here is the cassava promoting shade to other species. And once I harvest the cassava, because I'm planting on an angle, I'm not going to disrupt the root system of these little ones here. So yes, they can be quite close. The cassava is promoting shade, and that's not necessary. They're not necessarily competing, because they also have different root systems, and they also have different nutritional requirements. So here's some examples of plantings in high density. You have things like yam here, papaya, banana, baby fruit trees here, which will be fruiting in a while. The soil is covered. There are rows, there are spaces here into where the farmer can transit in the system to manage and harvest the system. The fifth principle, concentrate energy and generate biomass. This is especially important in areas that are where the AFS was implemented in, say, they are in an accumulation stage. They have been highly disturbed or highly degraded. When we are promoting a regenerative process through our management, what we're doing is we're trying to trigger natural ecological processes And these processes are taking place below ground, and there's energy flowing there. There's energy going on as a result of all these processes. So what we want in the system is that this energy is concentrated rather than spread too thin. I'll show you some, this image that might be easier to understand what I'm saying. So planting in islets, for example, say I want to implement in this area which is degraded, instead of spreading all the species that I have, the seedlings, the cuttings, the seeds that I have widely into the area, I'm doing replantings of smart consociations. Here I'm considering everything we've spoken before in terms of ecological function, in terms of plant architecture, in terms of species stratification. But instead of planting them all over the area, we're planting into little islets. And as the plants grow and as all the natural succession happens, these islets will grow and eventually occupy the whole area. Planting in straight rows is also a way of optimizing energy, not only for the plants and for all the ecological dynamics happening below ground, but also facilitating energy efficiency for the farmer, for the land use manager. So that makes it easier to manage the plants, makes it easier to harvest. This illustration here is more in relation to generating biomass efficiently. As I mentioned in the beginning when I spoke about grass management, in AFS we try, instead of fighting against the grass competition, we utilize the potential that grasses have for biomass growth. We utilize the efficiency of these plants to provide material for our other plant species. We utilize the grass to protect the soil and to optimize nutrient cycling. So here's an example of systems that were implemented in areas that were maybe pastures or the grasses were predominant. So we concentrate energy by planting the species I want in rows and applying frequent cuttings in this grass and applying the grass that I cut on top of the rows, of course being careful not to place the thick layers of grass on top of plants. So we place the grasses in a way that's not going to suffocate the plants, quote unquote. And then gradually these lines will grow in width, and then eventually these grass alleys, these grass rows will narrow with time. So instead of like sort of removing the grass at once, we are utilizing the matter that the grass is producing, and little by little we would suppress the grasses. This is an excellent alternative for farmers that have livestock as well. So on top of utilizing grasses for producing biomass in my tree lines, biomass and mulch, you can also use these grasses to feed your livestock. Here I'll show you in the next slide, some different designs that try to apply everything, all the principles we have spoken so far. So concentrating biomass, using stratification, covering soil. Here for areas that are slopey, utilizing tree lines as contour lines. So if you want, you can pause and have a look at these systems. So the example I was telling you about, using grasses, and gradually as the crop and tree lines expand, the grasses rows narrow, and eventually they'll be gone by the 7th to the 10th year. Here, sort of an alley cropping. Some more examples. So these images showing the utilization of grass. So you cut the grass and you apply in the tree crop lines. The same principle here. So you can see a thick layer of mulch here produced by the grass, the grass that is naturally there. So you're not wasting energy trying to fight against these species, which are very resilient. 6 principles: selective plant removal and pruning. So as you probably have noted by now, the principles, they sort of complement each other. And for the 6, just like we mentioned in the natural succession, we understand that in a diverse AFS, different species will remain in the system for different time periods. So it is important, once we observe that the plant has fulfilled its ecophysiological function, or the plant has yielded what it could, that we remove these plants, we remove this material in order to allow more space for the remaining plants to thrive, and also to utilize this material to cover the soil or utilize it for other purposes. And this removal represents sort of a stress to the AFS, but it's a good stress. Just like I mentioned in number 2, when an old tree falls off after a impactful climatic event, it triggers ecological processes, it triggers physiological processes within the plants that can stimulate plant growth, can stimulate the productivity, can even trigger flowering and fruiting of the other species that are around. So just like covering the soil and applying mulch to your system, I cannot stress enough the importance of plant removal, of thinnings, and of prunings. It is very important for AFS. The success and the productivity of these systems depend on these management techniques. So I'll just go briefly through them. Of course, there are other aspects, but for today is just so you know that prunings, thinnings, and plant removal are very important management aspects in AFS. So for pruning, for example, pruning trees from top to bottom, and pruning in a way that it brings more sunlight and air. For the plant removal, we're looking at removing plants that are in senescence, that are old, and plants that are from previous systems. Remember, we talked about whether the area is in accumulation or abundance. So in some instances, if we say we started an AFS in an area that was in an accumulation stage, but due to proper management, this area is now into an abundance stage. So it might not make sense to have plants now that are coriaceous, that are that thrive in acidic soils. We might remove these plants that were characteristic from accumulation systems and give way to introducing species now that are more demanding on nutrients, for example, fruit, many fruit trees, and giving now way for my system to evolve into an abundance system. So here's some studies talking about the enhancement of the productivity and profitability, minimizing competition. So these are some of the good advantages of properly applying plant removal and pruning. Here, an example of how you should prune your trees. It will depend, the way you will prune your tree will depend on the objective of the plant, and the objective of the pruning. So if you are pruning to stimulate flowering or fruiting, you will prune in a way. If you are if you want to apply pruning to stimulate biomass production, is another way of pruning. Okay, so this is more in general terms. So, for example, eliminating resprouts, so that will avoid the plant to waste energy in sprouts that won't be as productive. Leaving leading branches, so the branches that are more vigorous, more productive. Eliminating crossing, overlapping, weak or sick branches, and eliminating parallel branches as well, that will also help the tree utilize their energy in a much more efficient way. So as I mentioned, there are different prunings for fruit, for timber, and for companion trees. So now we're reaching the conclusion here of our lecture. These were some of the takeaway messages I brought to an agroforestry training that I provided to farmers in the Philippines, but I think that applies to us as well. So we'll conclude the lecture with some of these takeaway messages. It is quite common to see fruit trees that are for abundance systems being planted in areas that were highly disturbed or that are in accumulation stages. So this is the case of our observations in the Philippines. For example, they were planting cacao trees in areas that were highly degraded. So it's not that it's impossible to establish a cacao tree in areas that were highly degraded, but it is necessary that we apply a gradual transition and a gradual management to improve that area, so you can sustain a plant that is characteristic from very high fertility soils and evolved forests, such as cacao, such as coffee as well. So being mindful of the tree species and of all the species you are selecting for your AFS are adequate and matches the potentialities of your area. Also looking at improving diversity, soil cover and pruning. As I mentioned before, I cannot stress enough the importance of these practices not only for AFS, but for other land uses like orchards or plantations, timber plantations, and also for agricultural crops. Soil cover and thinnings are very important. Another important aspect that now it's more related to our previous lecture on agroecology is the importance of training farmers and extension officers to appropriately manage agroforestry systems. I'll give you the example in the Philippines. It's agroforestry sort of trending now there, but they are only trained on how to implement, but the management is very important and it's decisive. And also synchronizing plant schedules with application of inputs. This is another a more specific instance for their case there. So I'm just going to close off showing some pictures of some agroforestry experiences. So this is an experience in Martinique, in the Caribbean. And as you can see, it's a large-scale banana plantation, showing that agroforestry is not only for a small scale, a smallholder farmer. You can also apply the agroforestry techniques to develop highly productive systems with commercial purposes. Now here is another instance. It's more like a smallholder based integration of trees and crops. Here are some other examples. This is just to illustrate the importance of keeping the soil covered. An illustration here showing the integration of livestock, the possibility of integrating livestock into these systems. Here is a large-scale agroforestry experience in Brazil. Maybe some of you might know, called Fazenda da Toca. And here an example of a system that was established in an area that was dominated by grass. So just trying with these images, trying to summarize some of the concepts we saw today. You have the references of all the studies I used here. Thank you very much. I'll go back to the initial slide where I have my email. Once more, you are welcome to send me your reflections, your questions. Keep in touch. I'll be happy to hear from you. I heard from some of you from the previous lecture. I was very happy to see that. And yeah, thank you very much for your time. I'll see you next time.